Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the AICGS conference of this morning. It's a pleasure for me to introduce some of our, or let's say, our panelists to you. I would like to start with Minister President Armin Laschet, who joins us from Düsseldorf, Germany. We would basically, I think, translate that properly into Governor Laschet, because he's in charge of the most populated state of Germany, North-Rhine, Westphalia, where all the heavy industry is traditionally, where there's a lot of energy, business, and all other manufacturing companies. He is a very important player in the succession discussion around Angela Merkel, so I hope he will make it. He is running. He has a lot of support within his party and also from the electorate, from the people and from the media. He also does manage the corona crisis in North-Rhine-Westphalia for now several months, and he does a great job, which is appreciated very much from the people living there. I'm born in Cologne. I have still a house in Warendorf, which is one of the areas which are now a hotspot. And I really want to thank Minister President Laschet for the great job he's doing. Also today we have Governor Phil Murphy, who I think is really a value add to this discussion because he knows Germany pretty well. He has a business background. He worked for Goldman Sachs for many years. And in this function, he also was in Frankfurt, Germany for quite a while, and in charge of the German activities of Goldman Sachs. So Phil Murphy is also running an important state, the state of New Jersey in the United States. And finally, I would like to welcome our moderator, Nick Schifrin from PBS, which I think is a great choice of Jeffrey. And with this, Jeffrey, I would like to hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Martin. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And it's great to welcome people from Germany, the United States, and around the world to this discussion. The COVID-19 pandemic in a few short months has upended our public health systems, our economies, and had a dramatic effect on our politics. And in both the United States and Germany, state leaders have emerged in some of the most crucial roles. So what we're doing today is to bring together two of them, as Martin has just mentioned, to discuss their responses to the pandemic and hopefully to learn some broader lessons, not only for Germany and the United States, but also for the German-American partnership. It's an honor to have both the gentlemen with us and to have Nick Schifrin as our guide and moderator. But before we get started, I'd just like to mention one thing to you. Minister President Laschet is going to speak through an interpreter. So he will speak in German, and we have an interpreter on the line. So if you want to hear him in English, please look at the bottom of your screen, bottom right-hand side of the icons, you'll see interpretation. Please click on the interpretation icon and select English if you need the English interpretation. If you don't have to do anything, but we want to make sure everyone is able to understand and participate in the conversation today. We will be using the Q&A function, which is another button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with by now. So if you have questions you want to pose, please use that. We are not going to be using the chat function or the raise hand function. Stick to Q&A if you want to enter into the conversation. And so now I would like to hand over to Nick Schifrin, who is the Foreign Affairs and Defense Correspondent for PBS NewsHour. He is a winner of a Peabody Award for his series Inside Putin's Russia just a couple of years ago. He's an alumnus of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, which is important to us as a part of the Johns Hopkins family at AICGS. And he is somebody who brings depth and experience to this discussion. And Nick, the floor is yours, and please take us away.
Jeff, thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for being here, and thanks for having me. And we obviously thank Governor Murphy and Minister President Laschet for being here. I think some of the themes that we're going to touch on, as Jeff was just suggesting, we're going to try and compare some of the experiences of states dealing with two federal systems. We're going to talk a little bit about the scientific community and public health. And crucially, I think we're going to talk about regional, international cooperation. And that, of course, is going to allow us to talk about transatlantic relations as well. So before my questions begin, if I could just have each of you say a couple of minutes, introductory remarks. Minister President Laschet, why don't we start with you?
Ja, vielen Dank für
Yes, thank you very much indeed for this great idea to organize such a web-based conference between New Jersey and Northern Westphalia, between the United States and Germany. I would like to thank Chairman Mr. Richenhagen and President Rathke for this idea which they launched for this talk. And I think that especially during this time, we must exchange international experience. So I will make a few comments about the situation in Germany. We had the first case in Germany in late February, on the 25th February to be more precise, in the district of Heinsberg. There was a carnival party, and that is where the virus occurred first, and it then spread. And just a couple of days later, across Germany, we had rising figures up to the exponential growth in the month of March. And we are responsible for protection against infections, that is in the German states. But from the very beginning, it was also important for the federal government, Chancellor Merkel, the federal ministers, to be involved in the overall process. And we have had periodic conferences of the minister presidents with the federal chancellor, where we agreed on all the actions taken. On the 12th of March, we made the first step, that is, we shut down the children's daycare centers and schools. And at that time, for many Germans, this was extraordinary because it was the first action which we took, but it also made the seriousness of the situation clear. And the fact that this was accepted in Germany is also due to the pictures which we could see in Bergamo, Italy. Bergamo, the health system was overtaxed. We could see pictures of bodies of corpses which were taken away, and the German public was very alert then, and then everybody joined in, and 1 week later we had the lockdown. That is, all economic industrial activities were shut down, all the shops were closed in order to flatten the curve, and that was the general slogan. Flatten the curve in order to prepare our healthcare system for the situation of an exponential growth of the infection figures. We expected the highest numbers at Easter, and then at Easter, perhaps for the first time in 2000 years. Even during the war, there were services, church services, but then at Easter, there were no church services. The picture of the Pope on the empty St. Peter's Square also raised the awareness of the Christian communities, the Jewish and Muslim communities, so that all the religious communities, Pesach and Ramadan, so there were no communal services in the whole of Germany around these days. And we then had a discussion which was very important to me. That is, at a very early stage, we should discuss about when the restrictions of fundamental rights could be reversed again. And we restricted fundamental rights as we had never done before in the 70-year history of Germany for the first time since 1945. That is the freedom of religion, freedom of movement, the right to education and more. All this had been restricted because of the legislation governing the protection against infections. There were different responses in the different states. Some people wanted to be stricter, and I also advocated an easing of restrictions, and that is the point we have reached now. The infection figures are going down across Germany, but there are nevertheless local surges, and the surge, the outbreak in Gütersloh in a meat factory with 1,500 people infected within a few days indicates that the pandemic is still very active and that we must remain alert. And in this respect, the exchange with the United States That is how the population joins in, and Phil Murphy, whom I had the privilege of visiting in February in Trenton, that is how he is handling and managing this in his state. This is of great interest to us here. So my best regards to you, Phil, and I'm looking forward to your ideas and your comments.
And that's a perfect segue. Over to you, Governor Murphy.
Thank you, Nick, and I want to thank you and Martin and Jeff. AICGS is an organization that I've known for, at this point, well over 20 years. It does great work. And obviously, when I was the U.S. ambassador in Germany, it was of particular significance, but it remains so. Grüße und guten Tag an mein sehr, sehr guter Freund Armin Laschet. Wir haben in 2009 kennengelernt und war in Trenton im Februar. Und
my greetings to Mr. Laschet. We met in 2009. He was in Trenton in February, and he's an excellent Minister President, and he's also a very
So
good
with that, I
friend
will
of mine.
mercifully for you all out there switch over to English. And again, Armin Laschet is a great leader, and he's a great friend. So it's an honor to be on with him in addition to the AICGS family. New Jersey has been clobbered by COVID-19. There's no other way to put it. Over 13,000 confirmed, lab confirmed fatalities, 15,000 if you include suspected fatalities. We were and remain part of the greater New York City metro reality, and we got clobbered, as did New York. That's the bad news, and it's overwhelming. Having said that, the good news is we have come a long, long way. The positivity rates of people getting tested right now is only around 2% actually have COVID-19. At its peak, it was in the 40s. The rate of transmission is less than 1, and it's been less than 1 now for many weeks. At its peak, it was over 5, meaning an infected person was on average infecting at least 5 others. Our new hospitalizations are measured in the dozens, and they were measured in the many hundreds at the peak. So that's the good news. We've come a long way. We've been able to step by step reopen our economy and our state. But, and this is a big but, and I look at what's happening with Armin in Gütersloh and other outbreaks, we fully expect, even if we get everything perfectly correct in our reopening, that this is the sort of virus that will come back. That's why we've built enormous testing capacity, contact tracing, core of folks, isolation plans. So we hope for the best, but we're preparing for the worst so that we can spot it, surround it, isolate it, and drive it back into the ground. I'll leave you with the following observation, one last observation. We see what's going on in Florida, Arizona, Texas, parts of California, South Carolina, etc. We know that if we open up too wide, there are big risks associated with that. We wish them nothing, but we pray for them, and we wish them nothing but a speedy resolution to this. But just as our watchword was in closing to close aggressively, we are opening cautiously. In fact, it gave me no joy, but yesterday, as an example, I made the decision, and we made the decision, that we're not going to have indoor dining at our restaurants as early as we had hoped. We'll get there, but we've got to get there cautiously and responsibly. Again, thank you so much to Team AICGS, Martin, Jeff, and the rest of the squad. I don't know if Jack James is on, but I love him. I've known him forever. And Nick, back to you.
Thank you, Governor, and thank you, Minister President. And it's about 10:45. So as a reminder to everyone, I will go for about 15 minutes or so, maybe up to 20 or so, and we want to turn it over to you. So as a reminder, from about 11 to 11:30, we'll turn it over to your questions, and those can be submitted through the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. So, Minister President, let me start with you. And I was intrigued by the phrase fundamental human rights, at least that's how it was translated. Your concern about restricting those fundamental fundamental human rights. You mentioned the outbreak at the meat processing plant. This is by Germany's largest meat company, affected 1,500 employees. You had to reimpose a lockdown for that city through today. So how long will that lockdown last? And how concerned are you that either you opened up too early or that some of these spikes will continue, and that means the challenge will continue?
Also, wir haben bestimmte Bereiche behutsam.
There are certain areas which we opened again very cautiously, and Phil Murphy mentioned some such industries, and the restaurants are still closed in New Jersey, as he said, and that was the beginning of the opening again here. That is, indoor sports was again permitted. Initially, we had a ban on contact in the public space. That is, only one family alone was allowed to be together in public spaces, or two persons. 3, 4, or 5 were too many. They were not permitted to be together in the public space, and this reduced the spread of the virus. And this has now been revoked, but nevertheless, all over the place, there is the mandatory use of masks. That is, when you go into a store in Germany, you must wear a mask. In closed spaces, you must wear a mask. This is a very important regulation. And the second point is social distancing. That is, everybody must keep a distance of 1.5 meters from others, and public events with more than 50 people are not yet allowed. So there are still restrictions, and there was some easing of restrictions. And the case of this meat processing plant in Gütersloh has got nothing to do with the easing of restrictions, because meat production during the entire lockdown had always been possible, because we had to provide food to the population, also in supermarkets. So we couldn't say that the opening has the result. There is a problem now in the meat processing factory. That is, even during the strictest lockdown, it had been open, and now our major concern was whether the virus and the work in the meat processing factories is under horrendous conditions. That is, there are workers from Poland and Romania, for instance, and the working conditions there are no longer acceptable. This is why here in Germany we are giving thought to changing the contractual arrangements so that they become more socially compatible. All these people were housed together, and we had to impose quarantine on 10,000 people, even people who didn't test positive. And this is also a restriction of a fundamental right, that is, imposing a quarantine on someone who didn't test positive. And the main question is whether the virus spread from this group to the population at large. And we have now made 40,000 tests, and the result is that there are only very few cases in the population as such, so that the event has really been localized. And this is always the main criterion. That is it a local event? If not so, the entire district must be shut down.
Governor Murphy, a similar question to you. Given what Minister President Laschet just said, the requirement for face masks, the requirement for keeping social distance, you've talked about that as part of phase 2 opening, that people maintain those, or are they listening to you? And do you have enough tests to use the Minister President's phrase, make sure that any spikes are kept low?
Yeah, these are all great points. The answer is, and the Minister President alluded to this, there is no proven therapeutic, there is no vaccine. So we got to play the hand that we've been dealt right now. And that hand includes social distancing. It includes wearing face coverings. I don't have one on now because you wouldn't be able to hear me or understand me, but indoors, you got to wear them in New Jersey. Wash your hands with soap and water. If you don't feel well, don't go near anybody else. Those continue to be our best defenses, number one. Number two, it has to be said that the virus is a lot more lethal indoors than it is out of doors. So when you think of indoors, lack of ventilation, close proximity, sedentary, those are bad facts for this virus and its lethality. So that's why when you see a lot of what we've done, we've opened a lot of stuff outside first. So the inside stuff is very concerning to us. And thirdly, and finally, I have to say, happily, that in New Jersey, at least, folks have been extraordinarily responsible and compliant. So they stayed at home when we asked them to stay at home. They're doing, I think, overall a really good job of social distancing. I'd like to see more mask wearing, honestly, because we can't take any of this for granted. I hope at some point, either Nick, through your questions or others, we could talk about the inequities that this virus it did not create the inequities that we have, particularly across racial lines, but it certainly laid them bare. And that's something we can get to if time permits. It's an incredibly important theme for us.
And it's certainly a theme that has been highlighted throughout the United States, especially after the killing of George Floyd, and the fact that more people of color are being affected by COVID. I will come to that, Governor, but I want to zoom out a little bit, because I think one of the main themes that we want to explore today is the relationship between the state and the federal. And it seems that there's an interesting comparison to be made between Germany and the United States. So, Minister President, over to you first. The opening up that you led was within your power, within the German federal system, but it did put you at odds a little bit with Chancellor Merkel, who has been very cautious. Now, you haven't criticized Merkel at all, but you've been willing to pursue a bit of a different path. So can you talk about whether there is friction, and can you talk about your willingness to pursue that path?
Also, man kann nicht sagen,
well, you cannot say that I have criticized the German Chancellor, Mrs. Merkel. It was an open debate, and it has always been important to me to also keep an eye on the damage done by lockdown. This means that children were not in the kindergartens or in school for many weeks. And this was also a threat to the well-being of children. There was domestic violence. The elderly couldn't get any visits because we shut down the homes for the elderly. Some people didn't want to live because their relatives were not allowed to visit them, and they just died. And people suffering from dementia didn't understand the problem. There were also homeless people who all of a sudden didn't get any support because there was nobody there for them. There are food banks in Germany where they can get food. That is, food is provided to homeless people, and all of a sudden this had been shut down. Rehabilitation in hospital didn't take place any longer. In hospitals, we had to reserve beds for COVID-19 patients so that other surgery on the heart or cancer surgery had to be deferred. And my argument was that we have to weigh this off, because the lockdown as such would also cause damage. Initially, when the crisis was big, it was right to enforce it strictly, but when the infection figures are going down, you must find a point in time when we can reopen everything again. And was the debate. The German Chancellor had a somewhat stricter position, and perhaps she wanted to continue the lockdown a bit longer, but it was a very objective discussion, which was also appropriate for the situation. I think we shouldn't do any blame game here, or we shouldn't pursue party politics. And all of a sudden in Germany, right-wing parties, populist parties, lost their support, and the esteem of those in government, also of the German Chancellor, went up. They were appreciated more than before because the population felt that the crisis was being managed correctly.
Thank you, sir. And I'm sorry if you misheard. I didn't mean to suggest that you criticized the chancellor. Only highlighting,
okay. Yes.
only highlighting the difference. But don't worry, Governor Murphy will get the same treatment here. So partisanship or lack thereof in Germany, that is not exactly what we've seen in the United States. The president has been criticized and has, frankly, embraced some partisan battles, as we all know. But Governor Murphy, you've not, frankly. And let me take you back to April 30th. You were with the president. You've praised him. You said on April 30th, we're going to be in a very good place thanks to you and your team. So can you talk about why you've used that kind of language, despite the fact that the president has wanted some partisan fights, and despite the criticism of the president that does seem to be bipartisan?
Listen, Nick, I mean, anyone who knows me, I could stipulate this, and there's lots of evidence, which I won't get into right now, but there are a whole range of issues where I don't agree with the president, or in fairness to him, he wouldn't agree with me. And I promise you, I don't pull my punches, and I think everyone now knows that he doesn't pull his. Having said that, I don't wake up every morning and get to pick who the president is that day. There's one president, there's one federal administration, and they play an existential role, particularly in a crisis like this. So we have endeavored from moment one to find common ground on those areas where we could reasonably find common ground. And that predates COVID, by the way. But certainly that has been the case during this crisis. And in our hour of need, when it was, we were running thin and almost running out of ventilators or personal protective equipment or bed capacity or early stages testing capacity. Time and again, we've been able to find common ground, and that is a fact. The Veterans Administration, for instance, came in. We had an awful tragedies in our veterans homes. They came in and surged our management capacity. In fact, they, in addition to that, went to the private long-term care facilities. And again, we've been crushed in long-term care. That's an area that there are lots of lessons to be learned here. But again, we have been able to find common ground. There are a whole long list of areas where I won't agree with the president, or vice versa, in fairness. But when we've needed it, we've had that spirit of cooperation and support. Again, I know most folks realize and accept this. There's no amount of money that a state has that can deal with the crisis that we're going through. There's no amount of medical supplies that any state has got. The federal government is the existential player in peacetime, never mind in a crisis, but certainly in a crisis like this.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
In the federal states, is there a debate between Democrats and Republicans on the right way you are acting, or have you a consensus in the states?
First of all, great question.
States.
And I'll take this opportunity, Minister President. You look fantastic there. That's it. You personally look great, and your setup is great. I feel like I've brought my B game here. I'm proud of my flag, so that's about it. I see the American
flag. Work on your Zoom, Governor.
I'm shy at least a German flag here, so I apologize for that. Yeah, there has been, but that, frankly, right now, and we should take no comfort in this, because it's because of the tragedy and the crisis spreading to other states. When this hit hard, it hit hardest in New York and New Jersey. So we're the number 1 and 2 states in terms of fatalities. It crushed us. And we're both democratically led, and most folks did not see it as a partisan matter, in fairness, but some partisanship clearly crept in, and sadly, and that's I take zero joy in this, because now other states are dealing with big spikes in infections, and this has become now the fact it's a national crisis, and it's impacting states of all political stripes. And I hope, please God, I hope that we're all in this together in terms of the spirit of cooperation. This is beyond partisan politics. And I pray that that all of us see it that way and therefore behave that way.
It is 11 o'clock, but I started quite local with how to reopen. We talked briefly about the interaction between the state the federal, and I do want to just quickly get both of you on the international scenario, and there's already a lot of good questions that we'll come back to, including the economic aspect of this, but just internationally, Minister President, if I could start with you first, and again, try as best you can to be brief, even if this is a big question. You could become chancellor in a year and a half. How do you deal with the United States post-pandemic, or as this pandemic is finishing, when we've had a lot of tension between President Trump and Chancellor Merkel, and President Trump has ordered the reduction of US forces in Germany without consulting German leaders? Does that affect how you see the future of the relationship going forward?
Diese Krise,
this crisis, this pandemic, has, with respect to many aspects, actually, well, provided a focus. It's like a magnifying glass of conflicts which has always existed. Digitization got a bit push in Germany because all of a sudden, in this way, we had to communicate. And there are other issues which have risen up, and this includes international relationships. My basic conviction is that such a global pandemic also needs global solutions. We need more multilateral cooperation in order to combat such pandemics. It starts at the original place, China, and as far as we are concerned, we must also strengthen the World Health Organization, which must improve. And this then again comes back to our European situation, where we have too much national action. That is, everybody closed down the borders in the Schengen area. Each country took its own measures, and in a very hard battle, I succeeded in reopening the border between the Netherlands and Germany. During the entire period of the pandemic, we cooperated across the Dutch-German border with respect to the health policy, and we didn't shut down the border because the virus does not stop at the border. And this is now the problem facing the European Union. Tomorrow, Germany will take over the presidency in the European Union, and in future it will have to develop European answers to such a crisis. And I would wish that we return to a strengthening of the Western alliance, also in the international community, and the US and Europe should jointly act on the basis of their values. And we should also push for a better multilateral cooperation in such crises. This concerns health policy, but it also concerns economic policy, because after the pandemic, we will have the economic crisis, which have already started with millions of unemployed people. And we can solve this only in a transatlantic fashion, not at the national level.
Governor Murphy, quickly over to you. 2 points on that. Has this administration reduced the Western alliance, as Minister President put it, and has there not been enough emphasis on multilateral cooperation from Washington?
Yeah, I mean, let me say 110% of my life is focused inside the four walls of New Jersey, and unlike my prior position as the U.S. ambassador in Germany, where I was living the relationship in foreign affairs, I am a little bit removed, and you'll forgive me for that. But having said that, we have no better partner in the world than the Federal Republic of Germany. And so the deeper that relationship is, the better it is, not just for the transatlantic relationship. I believe it's in Germany's interest, but I know it is in the interest of the United States of America, period. So whatever we can do to strengthen that relationship, specifically, count me all in. Secondly, I'd make a similar statement about the transatlantic relationship in general, between the US on the one hand and the European Union on the other hand. The stronger that is, the better it is, not just for the transatlantic reality, that is in the interest of the United States, the cold-blooded interest of the United States of America. And then finally, I would say this, in the interest of time, a pandemic, it's a trite observation, but it's one that we all know. It knows no boundaries. It's part of the reason why, in fact, we in New Jersey formed a regional coalition with 6 of our neighbors for that very reason. And it's why, to Armin Laschet's point, the more cross-border cooperation, multi-regional cooperation, global cooperation we have, the better I believe we are equipped to deal with a pandemic. And that would be on my wish list, that the global relations deepen as a result of this. We learned some painful lessons, most importantly through the tragic loss of life. Let's not go through that again.
So I will turn over to all of your excellent questions, which are coming in fast and furious, and I will try and get to as many as I can. Governor, you mentioned the economic aspects of this, and that's where Mark Castle starts, and he has the first question, and I'll pose this to both of you. Mark points out that there has been Black Lives Matter protests, both in the U.S. And Germany as well. And we actually did a story with a Black activist in Germany talking about why there are protests there. So the question is about economic inequality and economic inequity. So let me start with you, Minister President. Can you describe whether COVID has been a triggering event for the disparity that we've seen, whether racial or economic, and could it trigger changes? Yeah.
In der Tat hat die
Indeed, the pandemic will have an economic impact, and we will have to make sure that this does not lead to a rupture in society. And the Black Lives Matter protest and what happened in the United States has also found an echo in Germany. Many people who are also demonstrating in favor of living together and against racism and against anti-Semitism. We are seeing people who take to the street who are subject to conspiracy theories. They're saying this is only an invention by Bill Gates, who wants to sell a vaccine. There are also some anti-Semitic aspects, and this society must be cautious that it will not be infected by this. And all this talk, which we also find on the web, is very aggressive. That is one part. And the second part is that we must also make sure that the vulnerable people in society do not suffer more. They are the first ones to lose their jobs now. The number of those who have migrated into Germany from other countries are the first ones to be made redundant. They will become jobless. So German society must make sure that there will not be an integration problem. And when the schools are closed, and when we have a sort of electronic lessons, there are many families who do not have the right electronic equipment. Then parents cannot help their children. And this is where a new social inequity might come about. That is, those who are in a good position also in digital terms, and those who cannot participate in this society. And for that reason, we decided, and the public holidays are starting now, and the families which cannot buy tablets, the government will make available tablets so that everybody will have the same education opportunities. This is a major step which has become necessary as a result of the pandemic, but it can also improve justice and fairness in education.
Governor Murphy, we just heard Minister President talking about disparities that are racial, what we in the United States call socioeconomic, as well as immigration. So the question to you, could both COVID and the Black Lives Matter protests be kind of trigger event for change?
I missed, Nick, the end of your question. Sorry.
Sorry. Could the combination of coronavirus and the protests that we've seen after George Floyd's death be the triggering event for change?
Listen, I hope so. I want to Armin's last point, by the way, on tablets and internet access is a huge one. Literally, I just had a meeting on that this morning, so I just want to underscore that we've got the same challenge here in New Jersey. The answer is yes. I mentioned earlier that COVID did not create the disparities, but it certainly laid them bare. George Floyd's killing through a different lens has laid them bare. The economic price that we are paying lays them bare. I'll go back to the health piece. If you look in New Jersey at the disproportionate impact of both hospitalizations, fatalities, certainly, there's a children's inflammatory syndrome that is small but very challenging. In all of those cases, Black and brown communities have been further impacted. And so just as this is a moment of national reckoning as it relates to law enforcement, community relations, what we prioritize in our budgets and in our passions, it needs to equally be so in a pure economic sense and certainly in a public health sense. Please God, we at long last learn these tough lessons and do something about all of the above.
I'm going to combine questions from Hillary Silver and Dr. Ursula Monk, forgive my pronunciation there, about federalism. And so this goes back to the whether there's any tension or the cooperation between your respective states and the federal government. So Minister President, let me start with you. Governor Murphy talked about having to create almost a consortium of local states in the United States in order to get some of the things he needed done. Can you talk about your interactions with the federal government, whether you got enough and whether you needed to also work with neighboring states?
Also es gab viele Beschreibungen, die gesagt haben,
there were many descriptions, many articles which said that German federalism is not appropriate for such a crisis. Actually, we would need a centralized decision-making process. But the answer to this after the crisis, no, not at all. That is, federalism has been confirmed because in every state in Germany, conditions differ. And the more you take into account the local situation, the more precise you can be with respect to response. A lot of responsibility rests with the health offices, which are subject to the municipal responsibility, and they organize the crisis teams at the local level. And I do not believe that you can organize such a crisis team from the top, that is for the whole of Germany, from the north to the Alps. And cooperative federalism, which cooperates with the federal level, is the right answer to this. And in the case of Gütersloh, this has also been proven. In Gütersloh, we had to react, we had to introduce a lockdown, but in Bavaria, where the infection figures are different, we do not have to reintroduce a lockdown. In the east of Germany, there are entire regions without any new infections. And for this reason, the main question is, why should we impose a lockdown on the entire country if we can fight against the virus at one specific place? And federalism is better in this case than a centralized government. And President Macron said in France after the crisis, in the centralized state of France, they need more federalized responsibility for the future. That is, France is giving thought to delegating competences to the regions, and I think this is the proper conclusion.
So Governor Murphy, is federalism, the federalism that Minister President Laschet is talking about, is that appropriate? We would call it states' rights, I guess. And I will ask you just to engage with the idea that not only came from President Macron, but also from an example of Taiwan, for example, or even Vietnam, countries that have done, frankly, much better than the United States by having a national system.
I think there's no right single answer.
Of the system that exists in the United States.
Yeah, Nick, I don't think there's any one single answer. I'll tell you how we have viewed this, not just in words, but in our actions. There's sort of three rings of responsibility. Number one, and most importantly, inside the four walls of our state. What are we doing in New Jersey for New Jerseyans? And in some cases, as Armin has said, some cases are very specific. I mentioned long-term care facilities. We're not alone in this. America, the world has been crushed in nursing homes and whatnot, but they're very specific responses, for example, there. The second ring is what I alluded to earlier. It's our regional partners. Not doing everything in lockstep with them, but harmonizing to the best of our abilities. I'll give you an example of a recent step that we took with New York Governor Cuomo and Connecticut Governor Ned Lamont and myself. We said, listen, if you're coming, we've crushed the virus. Please God, it stays that way. We've gone through hell and paid an enormous price. We don't want to have to go through this again. So if you're coming back to our region, or if you're visiting our region from another part of the country that is a hot spot, we want you to do the right thing. Self-quarantine for a couple of weeks. Get tested. We have testing capacity, get tested. That's an example of something. We're executing it differently in each state, but that's an example of a harmonized approach. And the third ring I alluded to earlier is there's no substituting for the role that the federal government can play in the United States. It can print money. It has a strategic stockpile. It can sign bills that come at it from Congress or not, as the case may be. FEMA is a huge player in this. The Army Corps of Engineers building hospital beds out in hospital capacity, just to give you two examples. So it's those three rings that I think we've been focused on. Not only I think we have been focused on, and we continue to be. And so I don't think it's an either or, it is and all.
I'll go to two questions about international cooperation from General Ben Hodges, an old friend, and also Carl Kaiser. Mr. President, let me put General Hodges' question directly to you, and I'll ask Governor Murphy a version of this. What do you believe needs to be done in order to rebuild the relationship between the United States and Germany?
Das ist eine schwierige Frage.
Well, I'm afraid this is a thorny question. And, well, of course, there is still cooperation. There is the cooperation between civil society. There is cooperation between the German stance and the lands and the US state, and also with the American administration. There's still cooperation in NATO, for instance. But I believe that you can improve the relationships only by means of tangible projects where you cooperate. You mentioned the subject of the withdrawal of US troops, or partial withdrawal of US troops from Germany. And this is not based on consensus, but if I do not misunderstand the discussion in the US, even among the members of Congress and the Senate, there is also a cross-party consensus that the troops should stay in Germany. What is decisive is that the Americans stay committed to Europe, and if some troops are moved to Poland, we are not happy about it, but nevertheless, it can also be useful for the transatlantic alliance. What would not be good if the Americans were to withdraw completely from Germany and Europe. This would send out the wrong signal, also in geopolitical terms. And for this reason, I believe there are many, or there may be many areas of cooperation where we can work well with the current administration. And however, you need tangible projects and actions in order to improve relationships.
Governor Murphy, I'll let you engage if you want with the tangible changes, if you do want to talk about foreign policy, the Trump administration, but I assume you'd rather answer a version of the question that comes from Carl Kaiser, which is, look, how can cooperation across the Atlantic Ocean and internationally help the United States deal with COVID, help the world deal with COVID, and help New Jersey do?
Listen, I first of all, General Hodges, I'm a big fan of, and Carl is an old friend. So two very good names to hear. I've been a believer, and again, this is outside of my current responsibility. I've been a believer in both the words and the actions that both sides of the Atlantic take to speak to the transatlantic cooperation and the military physical presence. As Armin has said, it's not necessarily magic that it has to be in Germany, but the presence in Europe, I think, I've always thought speaks volumes about the commitment. It's a tangible statement beyond just words. Listen, I think, again, the more we can cooperate, particularly on something like a pandemic, the better we all are. I will tell you, we have been actively engaged with Germany. Jens Spahn, to his credit, did a call right in the heat of the crisis when it was still raging, frankly, in Germany, and it was certainly raging here, with our team just to sort of go over lessons learned. We've spent a significant amount of time. Germany has on the field 3 extraordinary representatives leading their diplomatic presence in the United States, and we have worn out our welcome with the likes of Ambassador Emily Haber, Consul General David Gill in New York, and of course the permanent representative and dear friend to the United Nations, Christoph Heusgen. So we have actually been deeply engaged, trying to learn from each other. Let me remind everybody in closing on this question, Nick, the unknowns associated with coronavirus and COVID-19 far outweigh the knowns, and that includes everybody from Tony Fauci right on down. So the more we can get into cooperation and exchanging our thoughts and best ideas, the better off we will all be.
We have 2 questions on the future, on vaccines. One of them is from Anonymous, so can't quote that. And the other is from Christoph Plessen. And so I'm going to try and combine it. Let me start with you, Mr. President, of course. How concerned are you if certain parts of the world or certain countries get vaccines? And how do you see the idea going forward of vaccine distribution, and how can it work the best?
Ja, das ist eine sehr wichtige Frage.
This is a very important question indeed, because this is a very good example of the fact that international cooperation is of paramount importance. The first thing is that several countries must cooperate in research, and we are also trying to bundle this within the European Union to support this research. And in the United States, there is a similar competition, which is good. That is the first one to invent this vaccine and to produce it. But if this leads to new conflicts, also geopolitical conflicts in many parts of the world, to prevent this, it is important to make the vaccine available to everybody. There are many reports about Europe. There are many reports in the media about the United States. We all know the pictures from New York, and we also suffer together with the population of New York, also here in Germany, but we do not know what is happening in Africa. There are no TV broadcasters, there are no TV stations, there is no healthcare system of our quality in Africa, but we cannot allow entire regions of the world to be left alone, because such a situation might lead to new conflicts and wars. And for this reason, it is good once we have the vaccine, whether it comes from Europe or the US, we must also keep an eye on the entire world, and we must provide the vaccine to everybody in the world.
Governor Murphy, just like there's disparity in Germany or across the continent of Africa, there's disparity in the United States. And I will add that if the vaccine comes from the United States or Europe or China. So the question is to you, how should a vaccine be distributed? Can there be worldwide coordination, or do you believe that every country should or will take care of itself?
To say that some of this is above my pay grade would be the understatement of the year. I act most days now as an unofficial epidemiologist, so you'll forgive me for answering the question without a license. But just to repeat a couple of one thing that I've said already, and then one other thought briefly. Number one, the inequities that have been laid bare by this pandemic are jaw-dropping. Shame on us as a country, shame on us as a state, shame on us as a global society. Let's please God do something about that. Secondly, it seems to me a do something about that on the list would be equitable, fair distribution of a safe, scalable vaccine. It seems to me that's a very good step toward that objective. Thirdly, we don't have the vaccine yet. And I would just caution all of us, there's a desperation that we do have some signals from the big companies that are working on this, from the health professionals like Dr. Tony Fauci and Debbie Birx and others in our country. We don't have it yet. And the only reason I say that is clearly equitable distribution is going to be incredibly important. I don't want us to get lulled into thinking there's a panacea around the corner. The basic stuff that has allowed us to crack the virus in Germany, in New Jersey, we've got to keep up, and we prepare for the worst and hope for the best.
So I've got about 3 more minutes before I have to hand it back to Jeff. And so I want to try and just a very brief question that we just got from Phyllis Berry, and have you both just briefly describe it about schools, because I think it's so critical for anybody with children. So Mr. President, first to you, what is the status of German schools, and what's the main lesson that you would share as you try and open those schools? And again, a quick answer if you could.
Also es gibt eine riesige Diskussion.
There is a major discussion also among virologists as to whether children also spread the virus. Yes or no? Is there a special risk? There are studies which say one thing and the opposite thing, but there is no clear majority opinion of the global virologists. We've seen the example in Israel where they opened the schools and they realized that the virus was coming back and they had to close schools again. And we opened the primary schools very slowly, that is the schools at the lowest level, but after the summer holidays, we want to open the schools again in January. That is the decision of all the 16 German education ministers, and we'll have to wait and see under which conditions this can be done. And what is more, the digital education, digital lessons, I mentioned this, that is with the terminal devices and so on. All this must also be prepared at the same time in case schools must be shut down again, because we cannot afford another year of a lost generation, that is a generation without school education. And the problem is to weigh this off. Hygiene rules must be complied with, but keeping a distance, social distancing is very difficult in schools, and for this reason testing will gain importance after the summer holidays here.
Governor Murphy, quickly to you. You've got 1 minute on schools.
Yeah, I mean, we've just put out our guidance last week. Our fervent desire is to get back to school, but it'll be a new normal. Biggest concern is the passing of the virus from an asymptomatic young healthy person to a person who may be older or has other underlying health concerns. So that's why social distancing, maybe staggering schedules, some amount of virtual face coverings, that'll all be a part of it. I want to commiserate with Armin before I get off here about Fortuna Düsseldorf going down, but also congratulate Arminia Bielefeld going up.
It always has to be a football club. Gentlemen, thank you. Minister President, Governor, thank you very much for answering my questions and for answering all of your questions. And thank you for posing your questions. And back to Jeff.
Well, let me just thank Governor Murphy and Minister President Laschet for their insights and for taking time to go into some real depth on these issues today. And I think it's a reminder of the depth and importance of the German-American relationship that is so important to us at AICGS. There are 2 things that really stood out to me. One was Governor Murphy's comment that the United States has no better partner in the world than Germany. I think that brings it right to the point. And Minister President Laschet, I think you stressed that there is cooperation at all levels between the United States and Germany. But what we need now are concrete projects and tangible initiatives. And maybe in a bit of shameless promotion, I might point out to our viewers out there, just a few days ago, AICGS released a report in which we try to present our suggestions for concrete projects and initiatives that the United States and Germany could do under a president of either party in the next US administration. So we're trying to make our contribution to that discussion. Let me close by thanking Nick Schifrin for such a great job moderating this discussion today. To thank everyone for joining us, including our AICGS trustees who are out there today. and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks, everyone, and we will be back in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye.